Hello and welcome from the John Rylands Research Institute and Library. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our online event this evening, which will be exploring the Manchester Guardian and its connections with the Irish question, and especially the work of its famous editor C.P. Scott. I'll be joined tonight by Davies, who is a lecturer and researcher from Sheffield Hallam University and is researching the Manchester Guardian archive at the library. And she'll be joined by Dr. Janette Martin, who is the archivist that looks after the Manchester Guardian archive, which is one of our biggest archives at the library. So tonight we'll be showing two films, which will be Janette and Kathy discussing items from the collection and exploring the Irish question. And we're hoping that after each film, you'll want to ask us some questions. So there is the chat function at the bottom of your screens. If you just want to drop a comment or a question in there. We've got Caroline from the library who will be looking after the chat, and she'll be adding in some links to relevant details as we're going along. So just a couple of things before we get started. We'll be recording this evening's event, so it will be available on the John Rylands YouTube channel at a later date, so you can go back to watch it. And also there are auto-generated subtitles. So without much further ado, I'm going to pass over to Kaylee, who's our tech guru for this evening, and I'm going to ask her to share the first film. Enjoy, thanks.
Okay, so first of all, Kathy, could you tell us what you mean by the Irish question?
The Irish question concerns Irish nationalist demands for increased autonomy to govern their own nation, and the debates in Anglo-Irish politics on how to resolve this issue. So throughout the 19th century, you see an increase in Irish nationalism, especially after the 1840s with the Great Famine. And Irish nationalists essentially want to reclaim some political self-determination, which many thought was stripped away by the Acts of Union that united the Kingdom of Ireland and the Kingdom of Britain. So by the late 19th century, or sort of 1870s onwards, the Irish question is a focal point in British public life.
So can you tell me, Kathy, why this is all important to the history of the Manchester Guardian?
Because the Irish Home Rule movement was fundamental to the political evolution of the newspaper, and its editor C.P. Scott. J.L. Hammond, who was a correspondent for The Guardian, special correspondent, he attended the Paris Peace Conference for The Guardian, for example, also a historian of The Guardian. He says that the Irish Home Rule movement was a titanic movement that saw this massive shift in Guardian politics. C.E. Montague, the son-in-law of C.P. Scott, also recognised the Irish Home Rule movement as the moment where the Guardian moved towards this advanced organ of liberalism. And L.T. Hobhouse, Scott's closest confidant, very famous liberal intellectual, also considers the Irish Home Rule movement of the 1880s as this turning point in Guardian history and in Scott's personal politics, where it's, as I say, goes into this more advanced organ of liberalism rather than sort of Whiggish politics of the early 19th century. As well as this, the Irish Home Rule movement was the issue editorialised most by C.P. Scott. So it's the issue he cared about most throughout his entire editorship, the most long-standing issue that he talks about. So the Irish question actually inspired Scott to write and contribute more to the paper than he had ever done before. His most active years of editorial writing are 1919 to 1922, and the vast majority of these editorials are on Ireland. And it's no surprise then that these years, 1919 to 1922, encompass the Irish War of Independence, which was the apex of Irish nationalist demands for political self-determination. It meant war. And you also see the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. So it's no wonder that Scott was talking about Ireland so much at this time.
Okay, so Kathy, we're going to look at one of the Cuttins books, and I believe these have been incredibly important with your research.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's 4 of them, and for people not familiar with these kind of things, newspaper cutting books were sort of sold by stationers, and this one here is absolutely fascinating because it records all of C.P. Scott's editorials, so the items that he personally wrote about the Irish question in The Guardian. He meticulously recorded and kept them all here, and what's really wonderful is you can see his handwriting, and you can see the dates, 30th of July 1920 to October 1922. And as you've just told me, that's the sort of key moment in what was going on in Ireland.
Definitely. And it's the only way as well we can, like I say, see what Scott personally wrote. So there's no other way of finding that out. You can look at Guardian articles online, and you'll be able to find the ones pasted in here on the online databases. But there was all leaders published in The Guardian were anonymised. So unless you look at these books, you can't know what Scott wrote himself.
And what's really fascinating was the trouble he's taken, because he's indexed everything. So if we just sort of go through a few of them, you can see which topics he's writing about. So it's not all about Ireland in here. So we've got Churchill and the Conservative Party, but look here, we've got Michael Collins, electoral reform. And if we keep going, you can see that there is an absolute mass of information about Ireland that is very sort of meticulously recounted, you know, what page, what column number it's on, it's all there. So it does show you that to C.P. Scott, it was personally very, very important to him, wasn't it?
Definitely. And this is a period as well where, you know, the global political climate is in turmoil after the First World War. There is a lot of stuff going on, but it's still Ireland that he's most committed to at this time. You know, just underneath we see India.
Oh yes, and that just gets 2-3 lines,
The Indian nationalist movement itself is going through a massive turning point here,
Absolutely.
But it's Ireland Scott's talking about.
So, Kathy, what were C.P. Scott's views on Ireland, and how did he see the solution to the Irish question?
Well, as we've said, Scott and The Guardian supported Home Rule since the 1880s. But by the end of the First World War, he recognised that Home Rule was not going to be enough to satisfy Irish nationalist feeling. See, Irish nationalism or Irish public opinion radicalised over the First World War for a number of reasons. So Scott knew that the provisions given by the Third Home Rule Bill, which was yet to be implemented, it just wasn't going to cut it. This radicalisation of Irish popular opinion was demonstrated in the 1918 general election, where you see Sinn Fein, which is the more radical Irish party, win 73 out of 105 Irish seats. They decimated the Irish Parliamentary Party. That was the constitutionalist Home Rule party that had existed since the 19th century and had been promoting Home Rule for Ireland since the 19th century. But they lost loads of seats, 63 in the general election. So by this point, Scott sees this as a waste of time. You know, Irish popular opinion supports Sinn Fein, and Sinn Fein isn't going to be satisfied by Irish Home Rule.
So did Scott say anything about what was happening on the ground in Ireland? So presumably all of this is happening against a backdrop of violence.
He did. I mean, Scott blamed the violence that was going on in Ireland from 1919. Following the establishment of this Dublin Parliament by the Irish nationalists in 1919, you see violence start to increase. The IRA in Ireland and fighting for independence, you know, and violence continues to grow, 1919, 1920. Scott blames the British government for this, though. He says, you know, you should have granted Home Rule sooner. He blames British Conservatives for blocking attempts at Home Rule. He blames Irish Unionists for being divisive in Ireland. He blames all of this, but on the whole, on these sort of obstacles to Home Rule, which he feels if it had been granted back in the 1880s under Gladstone, we wouldn't have any of this trouble now. That's his view. So there's all this violence then during the Irish War of Independence. But the most critical sort of elements of Scott's editorials to do with violence, as it were, is around the violence of the Crown forces, not the IRA. So Scott actually doesn't talk about the IRA that much. He talks about the Crown forces. And the Crown forces became known at this time for a campaign of reprisals against the Irish population during the war, where they would commit indiscriminate acts of violence against the Irish population, regardless of whether they were civilians or IRA. So this could be burning down cottages or smashing up creameries, burning creameries, to outright murder. So Scott was exceptionally critical of this. He saw it as an affront to law and order, and that was an affront to his sort of liberal ideology. So that dominates Scott's editorials, especially from autumn 1920, which is when you see violence really at its height.
So how many of these books are there?
There's 4.
4.
But this is sort of the most densely populated, as it were. He didn't actually start writing that many editorials until the Home Rule Crisis, 1912, after the introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill, which is sort of considered the start of the Irish Revolutionary period. And that's when he starts writing most of his editorials. His earlier days, he didn't write so many personally, because he was in Parliament, but...
And does he carry on with such sort of intensive amounts of editorials later in his career?
No, he doesn't actually. Following the ratification of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1922, Scott's contributions to the newspaper actually diminish. Eventually, he stops writing altogether in sort of 1923. There's a sporadic one here and there throughout the remainder of the decade, but that's kind of it once he's done with Ireland. So this here is a Guardian Bulletin, which was published as a replacement for The Guardian during the printers' strike in September 1920. And it's an example of how Scott reported on the violence of the Black and Tans. So the title here is Anarchy in Ireland, and he's referring to the Black and Tans, not the IRA. And it says, this first sentence, "There is one aspect of Irish crime that is not fully realised in this country because it is utterly alien to our ordinary conception of law and government. That is the systematic destruction committed by the soldiers and the constabulary."
How does this conflict end?
Well, there's a truce called eventually in July 1921. And this is followed by months and months of negotiations between Irish delegates and the British. Scott actually plays a really important part in these negotiations. He even has meetings with Michael Collins and Eamon de Valera, who were leading Irish nationalists. And that was under the request of Lloyd George. So he actually asked Scott to go and have a chat with these Irish nationalist leaders to try and convince them towards the proposal of Dominion status, which was eventually offered after the truce. So Scott plays this important role there. He has a really close relationship with the Prime Minister, actually. So he's key throughout these negotiations. And then there's a conference held, the Anglo-Irish Conference, in October 1921 through to December. And eventually, the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed in December 1921, and that establishes the Irish Free State in 1922 as a dominion within the British Empire.
And through all this time, C.P. Scott has been there, hasn't he? He's reporting on it, he's influencing behind the scenes, he's talking to prime ministers, talking to Irish nationalists.
Exactly, and I mean, Scott was highly critical of the Prime Minister throughout the war. He was really against this policy of repression that the Prime Minister was running with. He was against the Black and Tans, but blamed the Prime Minister for not doing something about it. But following the truce, their relationship is smoothed over. They become friends again. And in December 1921, the day after the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed, the Prime Minister decides to spend the day with C.P. Scott. And in Scott's political diaries, which you can also read in the archive, Lloyd George and Scott say, you know, we've achieved the most important political work of our careers, of a generation. When the Anglo-Irish Treaty was finally signed in December 1921, Scott wrote an editorial that was published 2 days later. It was called The New Peace, and the first lines read, "It is only by degrees that we shall realise the great change which has come over British politics by the settlement, we venture on the unqualified term, of the Irish question. It has been with us so long, it has entered so deeply into the very structure of our politics and even into the character of our national life that its removal is like a change in the climate. Nothing henceforth can be as it was before.
So, Kathy, while we wait for the audience to gather their thoughts and put some exciting questions in the chat, I just wondered if you could expand a little on what Scott's solution to the Irish question was. So in the discussion that we've just had, you mentioned that by the end of World War II, the feeling amongst Scott and the Irish nationalists that Home Rule was just not enough. What was his solution?
So it was actually Dominion status for Ireland, which is what was eventually given to Southern Ireland. So Dominion status essentially dissolved the union between Britain and what became Southern Ireland after Irish Partition by the government of Ireland at 1920, implemented in 1921. But yeah, so he promotes Dominion status, which essentially dissolves the Union but keeps Ireland within the British Empire. So Ireland would no longer be part of the UK, but it would be part of the British Empire. So you still see that connection with Britain under the British Crown. So Scott sees this as the most generous and fair offer that Britain could offer Ireland, and he thinks that Ireland might go for it. Obviously, like I say, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was eventually signed. So they did go for it in the end, but we ultimately see a civil war after that too. So not everyone was happy about it. But yeah, Dominion status would essentially make Ireland a bit like Canada and other white dominions within the empire. Scott thought that the Irish would accept this. One of the main reasons being as he recognised that Irish opinion had only recently really gone into the arms of Sinn Fein, as he says. So he really thought that this was an option and that there were still elements of moderate opinion in Ireland, even though in the general election it looked like there was a landslide victory for Sinn Fein. He did not believe in an Irish Republic. That's something we need to really establish. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a moderate liberal, and the Guardian was a liberal newspaper. So he didn't want to establish an Irish Republic, and he didn't support that. But he did recognise Ireland and Irishness as its own individual nation, regardless of whether Protestant or Catholic. Ulster, from the Protestant counties of Ulster, or whether you're from the south, or he saw the Ireland as a united entity by an Irish national character, so he promoted a united Ireland under Dominion status, but not a republic.
Thank you.
Hi, Kath. So we've got quite a few questions coming into the chat and into the questions and answer section. So if you do have any questions, please put them into the question and answer section. We've got one which is asking about, did Scott have any personal connections to Ireland that motivated his interest in the topic? Or kind of linking into another question, did he understand about the labour movement in Ireland at the time and the intense class struggles that were taking place in Ireland? Just expand on that if you know.
Yeah. So as far as I'm aware, I've not come across anything where he's got these sort of family connections or anything like that, which I think is what that initial question is getting at. This was more to do with how he perceived ideas of political liberty and individual liberty and national freedom and things like that. And so when this in the 1880s, when you see Gladstone's first Home Rule Bill introduced, he actually takes a little bit of persuading in the first couple of months, and then he fully gets on side. And I think that's more about his own political motivations. He's going through this evolution of shifting to the left, as it were, rather than sort of maintaining some of the more conservative elements that characterised the early Guardian and his earlier politics. And you also, this is when you first see him try to run in a general election. He doesn't win, but he runs in the general election for North North Manchester. So it's also his initial first step into British public life as well from a political perspective. So it's not motivated by any sort of personal Irish connection, I don't think. It's much more that this was a massive issue in British public life, and Scott went through this moment of realising, you know, he was actually shifting to the left politically, the left of liberalism, when the Home Rule movement sort of was taking place. And he took The Guardian with him, obviously, because he was the editor. And what was the second question there again? Sorry, Caroline. About the labour movement in Ireland.
Was he aware of like the labour movement struggles and the kind of almost like the history leading up to this, so the intense class struggles that were taking place in Ireland during those years?
I mean, I have no doubt that he was aware of these things. He was a very, you know, perceptive and well-educated man, but it isn't something that he focuses on in his own commentary. It's very much like more high politics stuff, a lot of discussions around constitutionalism and big ideas around political self-determination, rather than sort of really getting down to the grassroots level of like say labour movements and class struggle and things like that, which were really important to Irish nationalist movements, but it wasn't something that he actually engages with himself.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had another question here. Did the editorial line of The Guardian have commercial consequences for the newspaper?
No, it didn't actually. I think most readers were on side. It's not like how, so, you know, you do see this happen with The Guardian during the Boer War period at the turn of the 20th century. So The Guardian was very anti-Boer War. And this was a period of really like heightened jingoism, imperialist nationalism. And Scott said, basically, you know, he was against the war in South Africa. And you see The Guardian take a massive commercial hit for this, but you don't see the same thing happen at this point in relation to Ireland, which I think is interesting. But I think, you know, most liberals were on side by this point. This Irish question proceeded and then carried on much after the question of imperialism in South Africa. So I think by this point, everyone sort of agrees with Scott to one extent or another, that, you know, maybe a few details here and there, but he's got the right idea that offer a generous offer to Ireland, but we still don't want an Irish Republic. And I think most readers were on side with that.
Brilliant, thanks, Kathy. We've got another question here, which is, what made more people support Sinn Féin after World War I?
Okay, so as I said, they what looks like had a landslide victory in the general election. They claimed loads of seats from the Irish Parliamentary Party. When you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of the, and as overwhelming as it actually looks when you count the seats, but still it was a very visible moment where it was like, oh, you know, there's this realization that Irish popular opinion do support Sinn Féin. And there's two reasons for this during the First World War, I think are really important to mention. So first of all is the British government's response to the Easter Rising. Easter Rising 1916, which most people I think will have heard of, or at least heard of in, you know, the Cranberry Song or whatever. So 1916, there's a rising in Dublin over the Easter weekend, and this is eventually suppressed. And a lot of the nationalists involved in this rising are then executed by the British government. And this causes a shift in Irish opinion and the way the government dealt with it. It's not necessarily that everyone was on side suddenly with the Easter Rising, but the fact the government were executing everyone didn't sit well with a lot of the Irish public. So you start to see a shift there. And Scott actually warns the British government about this in his own commentary. He says, you need to pack it in, you know, you're alienating moderates here. You're going to force people into the arms of Sinn Féin. Or towards more radical heightened nationalism. And this is also available to read in the archive in the commentary books. He's saying, you know, you're going to make moderate men become radicals if you keep executing these people involved in the Easter Rising. One of the other issues which radicalizes Irish opinion is around the conscription crisis in 1918 as well. So the British government eventually pass a policy to enforce Irish conscription. It doesn't actually end up being implemented because the war ends anyway. But Scott says similarly, you know, you're going to push people towards a more radical heightened nationalism if you're not careful, because, you know, Irish conscription is a really contentious issue, and that is ultimately what happens. And throughout his commentary during the Irish War of Independence, he kind of does a bit of a "told you so" sort of vibe. And in some of his commentaries, like, you know, when the government's executing militants during the Irish War of Independence, he's saying, "Haven't you learned anything? The reason we're in this situation is because you were executing people after the Easter Rising." And things like that. And haven't you learned anything? You know, this is your fault in the first place because of the Irish Conscription Crisis. So that thread actually goes through to his later commentary as well. And there is an argument that, I mean, the stage was set well before the First World War too. But they're the two issues in the First World War that really propelled this move towards Sinn Fein and move away from these sort of moderate constitutionalist approach to attaining independence.
Brilliant. We've got one final question for this section. So did Scott support the partition of Ireland? How did he see it?
No, he didn't support partition. The partition was first sort of tabled back prior to the First World War. Scott didn't support it then. He believed that partition was a divisive approach to Anglo-Irish politics, and that by partitioning Ireland, so you get Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland after the Government of Ireland Act. Obviously, Northern Ireland still exists today and is within the United Kingdom still today. But he says, you know, this isn't going to see an end to violence if you start cutting up the island of Ireland. He says that, you know, you're going to just entrench more sectarian division. You're going to make things much.
Seems to have lost Kathy there.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, so you froze a little bit there, Kathy.
Oh, can you hear? All right, okay. I'll just wrap that up then so we can move on to the next one. But essentially, he was against partition. When he realised that it was kind of inevitable, he promoted a 9-county partition, which meant there would be more Catholics involved in Northern Ireland, with the hope that reunification would be possible later down the line. But they went for 6 counties instead, and that's what we still see today.
Brilliant, thanks. I think we'll be going on to our next film now. But if anyone's got any more questions, we will have another section after this film. So thank you very much for everyone so far.
So Kathy, we've learned an awful lot about the Manchester Guardian's connection to the Irish question, but the burning question I have is how did they get all the information? Can you tell me a bit more about which Guardian reporters were in Ireland and how the whole system of reporting worked?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, without the reporters in Ireland, you don't have any Irish news, and that's what, you know, Scott based a lot of his editorials on, especially during the Irish War of Independence and especially during this period of intense violence. That's when you see the most reporters in Ireland, actually. From 1919, there's always at least one reporter in Ireland, but from the autumn of 1920, there's at least 2 or 3. And some will be stationed in Dublin, some will be stationed in Belfast, occasionally in Cork as well. But you can work out where and when these reporters were in Ireland by looking at these reporters' diaries here. So these record the activities of all the Guardian journalists, and you can just see here that in July 1920, here it says Ireland, and A.P. Wadsworth was in Ireland at this time. So Wadsworth did 4 tours of Ireland between 1920 and July 1921. And on his return, he was actually promoted to the editorial team based on sort of the impression he'd made by his work in Ireland. And as you know, he became the editor eventually in 1944. And actually, there's a number of reporters who sort of made the start of their careers was rooted in their reporting of the Irish question in Ireland itself. But as I say, like, you know, especially this violent period,
So tell me more about what they actually record this. So we get the initials, we get the topic. Do we have any sense of how much they got paid for each story?
No, it doesn't say so in here, I'm afraid. Obviously, you can then go on and look into the newspaper itself and see what kind of articles were produced around these similar times. So you can kind of connect up what Wadsworth might have written regarding Ireland in July 1920. But again, all articles were anonymised, so you can sort of make this connection using these reporters' books, but their names wouldn't be on what's published.
So that makes that incredibly valuable, doesn't it? Because, you know, if it's July 1920, it's about Ireland, it's Wadsworth. Or if it was about the King in Edinburgh, it's RHS. Who's that?
Spring.
So we know these reporters are in Ireland, but what would it have been like for them on the ground at this point in Ireland when there's, you know, so much violence going on? Was it dangerous?
It was. It could definitely be very dangerous. Journalists were subjected to intimidation, violence by the Black and Tans. Not so often the IRA. The Irish nationalists were very attuned to the fact that they wanted the press on side. So that was less common. Irish nationalists, part of their propaganda campaign was to involve the press in the war in Ireland so that they could build their international reputation for the cause. But the Black and Tans didn't like journalists reporting on their activities, smashing up creameries and burning people's houses down. So they would unofficially censor what journalists were doing. So they were subjected to intimidation, which obviously, you know, would have been quite frightening and very dangerous. But they still reported anyway.
Did other people have a role to play as well? So I'm thinking in particular of the London office. Did the London office of the Manchester Guardian have its own sort of direct line, as it were, to what was happening?
So absolutely. Not only are these reporters in Ireland fundamental to informing the office in Manchester of what's going on the ground in terms of violence across the Irish Sea, the London office of the Manchester Guardian is really crucial to reporting the political developments in Westminster. So you've got the parliamentary correspondent, the political correspondent. So that's Harold Dorr and James Drysdale. Both of these were important members of the Guardian staff who could inform on speeches on Anglo-Irish policy, who they were really especially crucial during the treaty period, during these negotiations between Irish delegates and British delegates, making sure Scott knew what was going off, although he did spend a lot of time in London himself as well. But it's not just the London office. You had special correspondents who really fed into ideas about the Irish question and reporting of the Irish question. In 1919, you've got the Paris Peace Conference going on, and J.L. Hammond was one of the special correspondents for The Guardian in Paris at this time. And the Irish had sent delegates to Paris to try and get their case heard. So he was reporting back being like, you know, this is what's being talked about around Ireland in Paris. And then you also have the New York correspondent, and there was a massive Irish diaspora in the US, as there still is, and the New York correspondent was really important to informing Scott of what Irish American opinion was saying about the Irish question, and the Americans had big influence on this.
So you've mentioned how important the Irish voice in New York and in America is, but I'm thinking much more closer to home. You know, Manchester, Liverpool, a very, very big Irish population. How did they respond to what The Guardian was reporting on?
Well, yeah, like you say, there's a big population, an Irish community in Manchester and the Northwest, and they wrote a lot of letters to the editor around his stance on Ireland as well. You see these published in the newspaper. And I think it's a really important point you make, that when we're thinking about the Irish question, we don't just think about it in this national, imperial and even global context. We can bring it back down to the local for The Guardian's sake and look at Manchester and Ireland. It wasn't just Irish news, it was local news. And this is actually reflected in the reporters' diaries. You see local news that is Irish news. So, for example, here, May 1920.
Oh, yes.
You see Harry Boardman, HB,
Yes.
attended a Sinn Fein meeting at Boggart Hole Clough, Manchester.
Well, you couldn't get more local than that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's what's so incredible about The Guardian, isn't it? It's a local newspaper, but it's massively significant nationally, internationally, and it brings it all together.
Exactly.
So, Kathy, as we've seen, the Manchester Guardian really did cover the Irish question quite thoroughly. How did the everyday reader react to this? Were they as enthusiastic as C.P. Scott about the Irish question?
Well, the best way to trace that, of course, is through the letters to the editor pages, the correspondence columns. And there were hundreds of letters written to C.P. Scott about the Irish question and his editorial commentary on the Irish question, especially during this sort of the apex of the Irish Revolution, which we've talked about most today, 1919 to 1922. So there's hundreds of letters. Some of them disagree with him. And this actually, you know, if readers challenged the editorial line, it could start a letter rally where you see other readers then respond, and you can see a bit like a thread as you would get on like Twitter today or something, except this is the old-fashioned version. And these threads then the editor would sometimes engage as well and respond and things like that. But on the whole, all of these letters that were published stuck to this constitutional moderate stance that Scott was promoting anyway in some variation or another. So really it was quite an extension of the editorial line. Even when he was challenged, these letter rallies tended to conclude with supporting him in the end anyway, which I think is quite interesting.
I suppose that's the joy of being the editor, isn't it? You get to pick and choose, and you get to publish the letters that accord with, you know, the direction of travel you want to go.
Exactly. At the end of the day, he was his own curator in many ways, and he curated these correspondence columns. I think he did have a genuine commitment to engaging his readership in public discussion around these big issues, but ultimately it did serve a purpose, these readers' letters, to promote the editorial line. And you especially see that after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. There are probably 2 out of hundreds of letters that at all challenge the treaty itself. It's very much, yes, treaty, this is the Irish question solved, everyone be happy and move on with their lives. But there does remain in the archive some letters that really do not support Scott and his views on the Irish question, which obviously we have here.
Yes, we had a lot of fun picking these out, didn't we, Kathy? So the one I'm getting to read is written to C.P. Scott. We've got no date on it, but it says, "Mr. Scott, you are a dirty Fenian and a camp follower of the Irish party, a radical of no importance. You know as much about politics as a pig knows about a white shirt. So to hell with you and your shadows." So definitely not mincing the words there.
No, very emotive, definitely. And whilst this is undated, I think it's fair to say this would have been over this period where Scott was writing about Ireland most, or at least between the period 1912 to 1922, which is sort of the Irish Revolutionary decade.
That would certainly make sense. And I believe you've got another one for us, Kathy.
We do. I suspect this was written slightly later because there's mention of the Kaiser. So as in...
It's wartime.
Yeah, so I expect this is written slightly later. "Traitor Scott, I cannot understand why a creature like you is allowed to encounter the earth, nor to produce such a vile rag as your Kaiser subsidised paper. You have made the name Manchester stink in the nostrils of all loyal people."
So do you think that The Guardian and all of C.P. Scott's reporting did actually have an impact in the grand scheme of things?
I do. Press coverage of the Irish question, particularly what was going on in Ireland, had a massive impact on the British government's Irish policy. But not only that, Scott was a highly respected public figure, not just in Manchester, but, you know, nationally and internationally as well. And The Guardian was a highly respected paper. It did have a relatively small circulation. It was provincial in character, but it was respected among, you know, intellectuals, politicians, policymakers, the people who made the decisions and led the politics of the country. So the fact that they respected Scott, respected the paper, is important, even though the circulation was quite small. I think we can see in some of these items here the local and the national importance of The Guardian and its editor. This document here is a table plan and a list of attendees to The Guardian's centenary dinner in 1921. And if we just see here, this is where C.P. Scott was sat.
Oh yeah, so he's on the top table, of course, and sat right next to him is Mrs. Fawcett.
Indeed. So the very famous suffragist.
And there's poets, there's Mr. John Masefield here, politicians' wives, Mrs. Philip Snowdon. So many names here, and so many people who are sort of famous on the national stage, but then you've also got sort of key local figures as well, so people from Oldham, of Hyde, of Salford, the mayor and mayoress.
Exactly. And if we actually just turn this over a moment. Here on table F, seat number 22, we see a chap, Reverend J.E. Roberts. He actually had a number of letters published in The Guardian on the Irish question, and he actually criticised Scott for his lack of coverage of the IRA, which is quite interesting. And J.E. Roberts was also on the Council of Governors for the John Rylands Library in the 1920s. So
the very building that we're stood in today?
Exactly.
Yes. So we know that C.P. Scott's held in sort of great esteem by sort of Irish leaders, by Liberal politicians. What did the Labour Party think of him?
Well, Scott, even though he was a Liberal, staunch Liberal, he did have a very positive relationship with the Labour Party. And he actually thought that the future of the Liberal Party, a close relationship with Labour was necessary. Mm-hmm. So he had close connections in the Labour Party, and we see that in this correspondence here. This is from between Arthur Henderson and C.P. Scott. Henderson was leader of the Labour Party. He was a prominent Labour Party politician in the early 20th century.
And what date's this letter, Kathy?
So this is from 1929, and this is part of a bulk of letters that were sent for Scott's retirement.
Oh, yes.
And this is a great collection of letters, actually, because it really does, again, show what people thought about Scott and The Guardian. He was held in such high esteem.
He was there 57 years, wasn't he? Which is absolutely incredible to think of doing that same job as editor for such a long period.
Exactly. And obviously he was an MP prior to becoming the proprietor of The Guardian. Whilst he was still editor, he didn't take over the proprietorship till 1905. But he was an MP, so he made a lot of these connections as well in his earlier years, and these were sustained all the way through to when he retired. And all these people flooded in with congratulations and well wishes and things like that.
So a bit like at the centenary, we get a real sense of the network and his sort of position within the sort of the local, the national and the international, all the different letters, congratulations really sort of cement how important he was.
Exactly. So even just in the Irish context, we know that the press was important to developments in the Irish question, in Anglo-Irish politics, in the conflict. But just on this bigger scale, we see what The Guardian and Scott, how well connected it was and what it meant to people, particularly these sort of high, these elites, these public figures who had power in the nation and locally, as we've said. So even these letterheads we have here just demonstrate the range of people who were writing to Scott upon his retirement to thank him, to congratulate him. We've got letters sent from the Prime Minister's office. This is when Ramsay MacDonald was Prime Minister. We have a letter from the Manchester Great Synagogue. We have a letter from the Federation of British Industries and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So all of these just show just a snippet of the range of institutions, the range of people who were keen to congratulate Scott in 1929.
That's been absolutely fascinating. I never quite appreciated just the significance of C.P. Scott in the Irish question, and about all the sort of background moving and shaking, the correspondence, the people who influenced, and the way in which politicians and prime ministers sought his opinion on this question.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. Thank you.
No worries. Just to end, actually, I'd like to refer to a letter that was sent by W.T. Cosgrave. He was the first sort of head of the Irish Free State government, and this letter again was sent upon Scott's retirement. Dear Mr. Scott, I cannot let the occasion of your recent retirement from the editorship of the Manchester Guardian pass without writing to express my congratulations upon your long and brilliant journalistic record, and to convey my sincere good wishes that you may enjoy many years of tranquility and happiness in your well-deserved rest. For 50 years, the powerful and eloquent advocacy of the great journal you did so much to build up was devoted generously and with indifference to popularity to causes which you deemed to be just. To the light which you so fiercely turned on events in Ireland in times when things seemed black indeed may be attributed in no small degree the better understanding which has happily come about between this country and Great Britain. Be assured that you carry with you into your retirement our deep gratitude and an appreciation of the high standard of clean and conscientious journalism for which you have always stood and with which your name is so closely associated.
Well, I'd like to jump in first with a question for Kathy. So I was quite interested in what you said about the Republicans having a very slick propaganda campaign. And I wondered what kind of form that propaganda took and whether you think C.P. Scott was taken in by it. You're on mute, I think, Kathy.
Standard. So as you said, Janette, the Republican government that was set up in that January 1919, which is sort of considered the start of the War of Independence, they were very attuned to the fact they wanted to get the press involved, and they wanted to promote their cause. And there was a number of ways they did this. One was through a really important publication called the Irish Bulletin. And this sort of was aimed mainly at newspapers and individuals in Britain and elsewhere rather than in Ireland itself. And this talked about sort of the crimes of the black and tans, and really sought to paint the British government and the Crown Forces in a negative light, with the hope that international sort of opinion would pressurise the British government to solve the Irish question, or to leave the Republicans alone, ideally. Obviously, that wasn't the case. So the Irish Bulletin was this propaganda publication that was quite important to the propaganda campaign. And that also promoted some of what we might call practical propaganda, which was sort of the activities of the Republican powers that sought to demonstrate to the world that their Republican government was legitimate and it was capable. So we see certain activities, sort of the setting up of their own justice system and things like that taking place during the war. And the Irish Bulletin reports on this quite a lot. So it's like showing, look, we can run our own country, we can run our own nation. So the publications are central to promoting this sort of practical propaganda. There's a chap called Art O'Brien. He's the press liaison who sits in London for the Republican government, and he sort of interacts with the British press quite a lot and sets up interviews and gives the press access to sort of information and things like that. So he's key as well to fostering this relationship between the British press and international journalists as well, not just in Britain, but Americans and the French as well, and getting them, trying to get them on side. So there's some of the key sort of approaches they take using publications. In fact, the Irish Bulletin was deemed so successful that the Black and Tans tried to counterfeit it during the Irish War of Independence. They did a really rubbish job though, and it was called out straight away. But C.P. Scott does actually talk about the Irish Bulletin in his editorials. he talks about the sort of the practical propaganda or the activities of the Republican Parliament in his editorials. So I'd say it did have some impact, definitely. He starts just referring to figures from the Irish Bulletin without any sort of qualification, you know, Shin Fein propaganda organ. He just starts using the information in there, whereas he doesn't do that with the British official news, because he doesn't trust that so much. So I think definitely it had an impact, and yeah.
That's really interesting, and particularly the sort of targeting the international audience and America, very much so. I think you've got some more questions coming in, so I'll let Caroline tell you what they are.
So your first question, Kathy, was presumably the majority of the readership of the Manchester Guardian would have been sympathetic to nationalism in Ireland. Is that correct?
I mean, yeah, you know, it's fair to say that with it being a liberal paper, the Irish question being a big cause for liberalism and British liberals from the late 19th century onward, those who were still reading the paper, knowing the Guardian's long stance in Ireland, probably were sympathetic. But I think one thing we need to remember, though, is the Guardian's readership is slightly more complex than I think it's often sort of talked about. You also get a lot of conservative readers reading The Guardian because it has a lot of business news and sort of gives commercial information for the people of Manchester as well. So, you know, you get more conservative readers taking The Guardian and reading it outside the Corn Exchange and things like that. So they're aware of sort of the business elements of the city. So they might not, I can't know, but I could make an educated guess that they're probably not as much on side as some of the more sort of the educated middle class liberals who liked to take The Guardian to read these editorials. It's hard to know how many people actually read the editorials. They might not have done. They might have read only bits of the paper. And I suspect those more conservative elements of the readership probably only read the business news and probably didn't delve into editorials and commentary on the Irish question as much. But on the whole, I think with it being a liberal paper for the educated classes, a lot of people would have been sympathetic, and that's reflected in the letters to the editor columns as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kathy. While waiting to see if anybody has got any additional questions, I just wanted to know what kind of people had their letters to the editor published in The Guardian? You know, was it a variety? Was it all the Conservatives maybe get their letters published?
Yeah, you do see a range. I mean, a lot of the names are quite well-known names. So you get politicians in there. You get but well-known locally as well as nationally. You get sort of public figures of Manchester who are involved in like the civic life of the city. They often have their names in there, like J.E. Roberts, who we mentioned in the video, who was important to the civic life of Manchester. So you see quite a range of political affiliation as well. You see sort of people associated with the Labour Party, trade unionists. You see Liberal Party politicians, Liberal unionists and Liberal imperialists and all the other sort of variations of liberal. You do get some Conservatives published as well, but they all are in this sort of moderate sphere. There's no one really on sort of the fringes or the extreme sort of side of things. The only time you do get sort of more radical people published is when they're not actually discussing politics. So, for example, an Irish nationalist, a woman called Morgan McBride, she's published, but it's talking about how there's children starving in Dublin, so it's more of a humanitarian approach rather than the high politics stuff. And that's the point, actually. There's hardly any women published, which probably doesn't come as much as a surprise to most of us, but it's very limited. During the War of Independence, you see over 100 letters published, and of the ones you can tell who are women, because a lot published under pseudonyms, so they could have been women. But you can only see 8 letters that are actually obviously written by women. So there's a gender dynamic there as well.
Can we talk a little bit about the exhibition as well? Because
yes, sorry, we're going to run out of time.
I was dying to mention all this talk about letters, and you picked up on it, Kathy, when we were talking about the Boer War. So subscriptions definitely plummeted during the Boer War. And what's fascinating, it's very similar with the Irish letters that we read out. We have boxes and boxes of people writing in. Some people are full of praise. So one of the letters we've got sent from Liverpool actually, March 1900, talks about the Manchester Guardian having real grit in standing up and opposing the war, and truth is a higher thing than personal profit. But then we get another very, very angry letter, unsigned, angry letters often are, in which the author laments the editor's invincible prejudice against his own country in favour of the Boers. So that kind of dynamic of people writing in, neither of these were published, I should say, but it's so interesting, isn't it, how a newspaper is so much more than just the editors, it's also the community of readers, it's the subscribers.
There's a few letters as well, Janette, actually, in the collection of retirement correspondence that say, you know, there's this one chap, and I can't remember who it is now, but he's writing from Glasgow, and he says, I used to wait for the train from Glasgow to bring my copy of The Guardian, so because it was the only paper that was opposing the Boer War and things like that. So it's very much remembered, and this is, you know, sort of nearly 20 years later, nearly 30 years later, sorry. This is very much remembered by readers as a key turning point as well. So I think there's a lot of similarities between the Scots approach to the Boer War and Ireland.
Definitely, yeah, that principled stance. And in the exhibition as well, we've got a whole case devoted to Scott. So even though the exhibition covers 200 years, he is such a pivotal figure. Until I spoke to Kathy, I hadn't quite realised how much Ireland had shaped his views and, you know, sort of made him, you said an interesting comment about moved him to the left of liberalism. And I hadn't really thought about that till you said it. So that's really interesting.
Kathy, you kind of talked about women actually in your comment before. We've just had a question saying, were there any women who influenced The Guardian on the Irish? I know you mentioned one person in particular, but were the ones maybe behind the scenes that did get a mention in the editorials?
Yeah, I reckon so. So there's a woman called Alice Stopford Green, who was is very quite well known. She's still a moderate Irish nationalist. She actually has letters published in The Guardian as well. And when Scott's writing to her in, I think it's in 1926 or something like that, they're discussing how they used to go to parties together in London, and I'm like, hey up.
After he was married.
She definitely had an influence on him, I think. And she wrote to him before the start of the Irish War of Independence and was like, send a correspondent to me, and they can come and stay with me in Dublin. And actually, she was part of the Sinn Fein, the Republican propaganda campaign in some ways, because she helped facilitate some of the sort of the activities of a journalist being able to get access to figures in Sinn Fein and things like that, even though she was a moderate. She did play that role too. So yeah, Alice Stopford Green, she's an interesting character.
Fantastic. I think we're coming to the end of our evening, so I'm going to hand back to Gemma, but I'm going to pop Kathy and Janette's details up online so anybody can contact them, and I'm also put some links into the chat linking to Kathy's fantastic blog and also the actual Guardian archive that you can look online as well.
Yeah, and do come to the exhibition.
Fabulous, do it.
Absolutely. Well,
the exhibition, the online version is just as good, almost. You just have to have what the basket looks like in a 3D fashion.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just going to echo that and say thank you to everybody who's contributed tonight. So Kathy and Janette for wonderful videos. Thanks for Caroline for looking after the chat so well, and Kaylee for the tech support. And as Janette and Kathy sort of mentioned, it's such a wonderful archive, and you can actually, you know, access it physically in the library by coming to book into to see us in the reading room, but also there's lots of other ways that you can access the archives and other collections digitally, so you can do that from wherever you are, from the comfort of your own home. So all the information is on our website, and how to access it and when is all there. And as Janette says, we've got this wonderful exhibition that's on till October. So we are open to visitors at the end of the week. Just check, obviously, the website before you come, and you can book a ticket to come and see the beautiful building and the fantastic exhibition as well, and we'll be really happy to welcome you. It's nice to be back. So yeah, just to say thank you, and thank you to everybody who sent in a question. As I say, you can contact Kathy in other ways, on other channels, if you want to continue the conversation, which is what we really encourage. But again, just to say thank you to everybody for joining us this evening, and I'm going to say goodbye to everyone.
You, everyone.
Thank you.